Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here at 8:30. I have the honor of introducing Nicole Tisdale, Interim Senior Director at Aspen Digital, the Aspen Institute. She is going to be the moderator of this panel, Resourcing Cyber Resilience at the state and local level. Would you please welcome her and her panelists on stage, please?
Good morning, y'all. I'm Southern, so when I say good morning, y'all say good morning back, okay? Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, good. Y'all can head down south after this if you enjoyed doing that. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is your first session of the day for most of you all, and so we're so excited that y'all decided to join us today for this important conversation about how the resources that are needed for state and locals to tackle their cybersecurity issues. I'm super excited to be joined this morning by Colin Ahern, who is the Director of Security and Intelligence for the state of New York, a new position he was just appointed to, first time ever, so a special round of applause to him. Also, Cleveland is the Executive Director for UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, and from the San Francisco area, and so got the kudos for being in charge of all the recommendations for us where we are supposed to hang out for RSA. Thank you. And then also Mark Montgomery, who is the Executive Director for the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. And so as we jump into our conversation today, giving you all a little bit of the roadmap, congratulations, you are at a policy discussion. If you did not think you're in a policy discussion, still stay. But we want to talk about, as we think about cybersecurity policy, we think about it in a very similar way as cyber operations. And so today today we're going to give you the threat landscape. We're going to talk about some of the tensions that are currently happening in policy. And then, because we don't want to be people that just talk about the problem, we're going to identify some of the solutions that we think can help us get to the most expeditious result. And so with that, I'm going to start with you, Mark. I want us to talk about what the current cyber threat landscape looks like for state and local governments, and how has federal policy shifted over the last year, 5 years, as it relates.
Yeah, thanks. And if I'd been here last year, I think I'd say the same thing, that I think it's bad and getting worse. And it's getting worse because our adversaries are getting better. And I think we're required to upfront say China and Russia are more serious threats as nation states, but the threat from criminal actors and the threat from Iran and North Korea can't be dismissed. I think it's always worth saying, even though it's 2 years old now, Volt Typhoon's a serious issue. What China is doing inside our critical infrastructures is what we would call in the military, I'm a retired admiral, it's a operational preparation of the battlefield. It's what we would do to an adversary prior to striking. We would go into their systems, we'd get hooks, we either put malware in or a way to get back in at a later date so that we can use that, we can disrupt or destroy that critical infrastructure. One thing I want to point out that isn't always said, this was not either random or just kind of macro delivered everywhere. It's targeted at our military mobility and our economic prosperity. It goes at our rail networks, our aviation, our ports. And conveniently, I thought this was unbelievable when I was active duty. I still think it's unbelievable 5 years later. We actually list our 20,000 miles of strategic rail network. We list our 69 strategic airfields. We list our 18 strategic seaports. So the Chinese don't waste their time with the other 500 airfields or the other 60,000 miles strategic rail network. They instead can concentrate on the actual ones that matter to moving forces to get from like forts to ports to overseas. And so that's a very significant nation-state threat. I used to downplay Iran and North Korea because I felt they were more criminal actors in the case of North Korea. And in the case of Iran, they really used their cyber to harass and intimidate domestically and to harass their expats overseas, particularly ones who are activists against the regime. But they've shifted from that. They have a lot more hacktivist groups alongside their advanced persistent threat teams, and we're seeing them out there. The one thing I would say about this is, and you asked over the last year, We just issued 3 large strategic documents, a national defense strategy, a national security strategy, and a national cyber strategy, and none of them mentioned Volt Typhoon. Only one of them really mentioned China as a cyber threat, and even then it was a glancing blow in the national cybersecurity strategy. This is unacceptable. This is like denying the obvious, and then it has the impact when you ask what's the impact. The impact is if, and Colin will know this better than anybody, if you don't state the problem up front, you won't get resources. So I question whether cybersecurity will get the federal resources it needs to support the state and local governments. And then if you're a state and local government and you've got 500 problems and $25, you're not going to put any of it against cybersecurity if you're not told it's an actual issue. So I think things are bad or getting worse, and a little bit of it's self-inflicted.
Yeah, I think that, when we have these policy discussions, I think sometimes people minimize the impact of these strategies. A strategy is a government telling you this is our roadmap and these are our priorities and this is how we're going to keep you safe. One of my trivia questions for cyber people in policy is, do you know the first president that ever included cybersecurity in their national security strategy? And people usually go back to like the 70s and the 80s, and I'm like, no, it was the Clinton administration, and it was after the Oklahoma City bombing, because that was a signal to the U.S. government, to our state and locals, but also to the American people. This is a threat to you, and we are coming up with a strategy on how we're going to protect you. And so strategies are much more important than I think a lot of people realize in the policy context.
I just need to say I'm so old. I actually worked in the Clinton administration when we wrote that national security strategy for Dick Clark, and wrote the cyber into it because it came on the heels of PDD 63, if you all remember that. Anyway, sorry.
No, that's good. I'm adding that to my trivia. And so and I promise we did not purposely sit in this order, but okay, so we're talking about at the federal level. And so I want to turn to Ann next. Your work at Berkeley, you all are working across multiple states across the United States. And so I want to talk to you. I want to give you kind of the same question of, like, from a policy standpoint, working with so many states, tell us how you're working with the states, but then also how do you think the threat landscape looks for state and locals?
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks everybody for being here. So we can offer a little bit of a bird's eye perspective from our research and practice. We convene a network of over 40 university-based cybersecurity clinics in the United States, in over 28 states now, I think, that are working directly with local communities to shore up their cybersecurity. And my group also just published a state cyber policy tracker from 2025. So I'll offer a bit of perspective from that work. The good news is, despite what Mark said, that states have 500 priorities and $25, states are stepping up. 37 states were able to pass bipartisan state policy in cybersecurity last year. 37 states, and looking across that, states do know where the help is needed in their states and in their communities. A lot of that legislation focused on state agencies, but a lot of it focused on educational entities, including K through 12 schools, which we know are targets of ransomware and other attacks, as well as high risk, but typically under-resourced critical infrastructure. So states are doing a lot, but, and Colin will be able to speak to this better than anybody, the threats are growing faster than state level capacity is growing. And I think the uncertainty in federal funding especially impacts smaller states with smaller budgets more than the big states with the largest economies. And so the gap between the haves and the have-nots is growing, whereas all of these critical infrastructure, K through 12 schools, local communities, local municipalities are important in every state and every community.
Yeah, well, thank you for that context. And I want to turn to Colin, as we've talked about at the federal level and across states, but very focused on New York. And I want to say for people, as we talk about the big states, New York is one of the most diverse states in our country. I worked in Congress for 10 years on the Homeland Security Committee, and I spent a lot of time on the northern border. And I can attest, as a Mississippian, upstate New York is the most Mississippi place that you will ever visit outside of Mississippi. And so I find it interesting when you talk to people from New York State, especially in your new role where you are responsible for not just the New York cities, but also these border towns and these small towns that don't have the resources of a New York City. So talk to us, Colin, what does it look like on the ground? And also when you have such diverse cities and counties?
Yeah, New York is obviously, I have lots of love for both Mississippi and upstate New York. But obviously it's bad and it's getting worse, that's absolutely right. And I think we're really faced with a disintegration of the historical conception of war is on the one hand and peace is on the other, and then you're gonna know B-52s are gonna be lifting off from Stewart, and then you're gonna just, that'll be it. That's not the case anymore. Obviously, principally, the Russians and certainly the Chinese are very into what they're calling the hybrid war tactic. And for those not familiar, that is the use of economic coercion, political corruption, transnational repression, and cyber, right? Principally facilitated. You can think of cyber as the foundation, right, for this hybrid warfare tactic, because all of these things are facilitated by, with, and through the internet. And as Mark said before, we know where our critical infrastructure nodes are that support major population centers. We know where we need to do, from forts to ports to overseas, just like the Admiral said. And so those facilities are regulated by a diverse array of stakeholders, lots of times at the state level, right? So within the context of hybrid warfare, you see that most principally at the state and the local level. And so, serious people write things down. And one of the first things the governor did very early in her administration, even before her reelection to her current term, was to write a strategy which has 3 pillars. One of them is unification. That's, coordination, operational coordination across different sectors of government. And the use of shared services, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But value-added shared services that are free like a sandwich, not free like a puppy, right? Because one of the problems is that if I give you something for free, but then you got to take care of it, you got to feed it, you got to buy it, you got to support it, you got to maintain it, that's not actually free. And we're talking about, to your point, this is a remote and attenuated environment. One of my favorite anecdotes is that it is a county up north. And so one of the county deputy administrators, so a senior appointed official, has 3 jobs. Ed. He's also the exterminator. He's also the county IT administrator. He's also the county deputy administrator. These are all 3, 1 full-time job and 2 part-time positions, right? So it's got to work for Ed. When you think, what is your shared service and what is the piece of, Ed will read a PDF as a smart guy, but a PDF isn't gonna make Ed and his network safer, right? And so we think about what are those services that, and Ed is not an unsophisticated person. I don't mean to imply that. Ed is just very busy, doesn't have a lot of time, doesn't have a lot of money. So when we think about these shared services, that is the context in which we operate. And so obviously these things are all related. And in particular for our northern communities, we talk about the 4 legs of the stool: power, water, public safety, and healthcare. And so we have, I think, a responsibility to not treat all critical infrastructure the same as one big, undifferentiated mass of critical infrastructure. Obviously, we need to be principally concerned with those things that, if the power goes out, you shelter in place. If you don't have any water, you got to leave the building. So power and water are the mother and father of critical infrastructure, and one of the ones for which there is, I think, the most need in the short term, because exactly like Mark said, our adversaries are not sitting around. They are deliberately holding these infrastructures at risk in a way that I think should concern all of us.
Colin mentioned something really interesting there, which is prioritization. And we always have to prioritize, but when resources are short, which is what I think we would all acknowledge, then the prioritization is even more critical. If you have not prioritized, you'll end up spending money on priority number 7 because it has a friend in an appointed position somewhere. You really need to prioritize, so when you get the 5 cents or nickel or $10, you're ready to go.
Yeah, and I want to stay on this point a little bit, Colin, and as you talk about the fact that you all have a strategy, New York also has legislation in place to make sure that this funding is continuing. And part of the work that we've been doing at the Aspen Institute is really trying to get people in the room and talk about some of the tensions. And so I feel like that's a good place of like, the best case scenario, there is a strategy where you prioritize, you have legislation so that you make sure it is continuously funded, it's not just a press release. And so I want to ask you, as we talk about that, what does that look like in terms of what we can realistically expect the states to do, and what does the federal government actually need to step in and do?
I think first and foremost, serious people write things down. So we need to demand serious documents from our federal officials that correctly identify the problem and set up a framework in which meaningful collaboration, not just you're going to be over there and I'm going to be over here, but meaningful operational coordination, because one of the features of the hybrid war concept is the collapse of these distinctions and the use of the adversaries to sort of attack these gaps and seams, which is obviously a well-covered topic, and actually both Ann and Mark have written extensively about it. And you should all read their stuff, and it's amazing, right? But secondarily, government wins derive from precisely three things in precisely this order. Number one is authorities, right? You need to have a law. Number two is appropriations. You need to have money. And number three, you need to turn your authorities and your appropriations into capabilities, mission-focused capabilities, which, just like Admiral Montgomery said, are centered on a ruthless prioritization of the problem, right? And because you cannot do all of the things, that is not going to work. And in particular, you must structure your capabilities to be highly, highly focused on the things that only you can do, right? And so that's one of the things that we think about in New York State is there are many things that we want to continue to improve on. We got our shared services program in the baseline budget, which is a big deal. We got it written into the law, which is fantastic. We got, a variety of things like written into law because we identified the problem. We worked across boundaries. Chair Garbarino at Homeland Security, Ranking Member Meeks on the Armed Services Committee, obviously, Leader Schumer, but also at the state level in our lower house and in our Senate across party lines and across multiple jurisdictions. And then finally, you need to, you don't have to narrate every single thing what you're doing, but you need to convince people that you are a serious person who is not going to leave them in the lurch, because one of the things, returning to Ed doesn't want to invest a whole bunch of time on something that's not going to be here in 2 years, because that's just not a good use of his time.
I think that is, and I want to stay on this tension a little bit more because I want to turn to you, Mark, and I want to talk very specifically about the federal, state, and local cyber grant program. And I recently released a paper with National Rural Water where it was very focused, the audience is Congress, and it is like, we need authorities, we need appropriations, this is how much money we need, this is when we need it. And it is, for a lot of people, and we all work in policy, and people aren't used to folks being that direct, but it's so dire in water that we have to say, we need $25 million over the next 4 years. We need to prioritize rural water because of the military installations, because of the data centers. It is not just rural people who depend on rural water. And because there's this urgency that it feels like the federal government is not really understanding the resources that state and locals even have for based off the risk and the targets. And so I want to talk to you, I want to ask you very directly, Mark, what is going on with the state and local grant program, and what do we need to do?
So I'll describe, I think we have opportunity, we have angst, right? The opportunity is that the state and local is getting extended, but without appropriation. So it's being authorized without appropriations. I think it'll continue to get authorized. I think Senator Paul will make sure it's authorized in very small increments, but I think they can still do it.
But what do you do if you keep getting authorized and there's no money to
Yeah, so that's the opportunity. I think that the supplemental bill that's coming through for Department of Defense is for $200 billion. I do this military stuff for a living. I'll just say, if our bill at the end of 2 months is more than $50 billion, I'd be surprised. So that means DOD is putting a lot of fudge in that $200 billion, and some of that fudge historically goes into other national security needs. I think taking $1 billion of that supplemental, and in the same way, last time we had $1 billion over 4 years, it was probably the first and fourth year were kind of short years. The second and third year were thick years of 350 million apiece, 400 million. And my only question in my mind is whether it should be $1 billion or $2 billion. I say that because last time it happened, states like New York that knew how to exploit federal government grant programs well.
We prefer the
Use. Who had a person like Colin, right? A lot of states don't. I mean, that's the fact. I mean, that's the honest truth, particularly the smaller ones, as you said. And to give them a chance to compete without denying the states that are organized a chance to compete, you probably need more money in the kitty. So I would argue for $2 billion. I'd take $1 billion. I'd want the same 3 or 4 years to implement it, only because you don't want people spending money fast. Historically, there was a good reason it was $100 million on the front end and $100 million on the back end. The back end was the end of the puppy the puppy love, and most of it needs to be sandwiched, stuff that that helps you right through. The angst is the other part of federal government funding was sector risk management agencies, which are brutally underfunded. Now, there's exceptions. Energy's funded well. So you know that the government knows the right answer, because on occasion, they fund it right. DOD's funded well in this area. Energy's funded well. Financial service, Treasury's funded okay. And now I've got 14 other not okays. Some of them, like education and agriculture, try to do sector risk management agency responsibilities on $250,000 a year, which all of us know is one full-time equivalent, one human being, basically website management. That's not supporting. And I'll go one further and say their job in supporting, so when we talked about rail, aviation, ports, most people don't know that rail is, the cybersecurity for that is done by TSA after they're done groping you at the airport and fixing pipeline security. They then turn around and try to fix rail security. They are not manned, equipped, even without a shutdown. They're not manned, equipped, and resourced properly for that mission to help the thousands, not the big 8 railroads, but the thousands of small rural junctions. The Chinese aren't attacking rail cars, they're attacking rail junctions that are operated by, like, Uncle Fester's Rural Rail Collective number 33. He's got 50 miles of rail, and he thought his job was to keep it clear as steers, when in fact, or dead steers. His actual job is to manage the fiber optic network that runs under it, and he doesn't know how to do that. So it's opportunity with the supplemental, and it's angst with the actual budgets that are getting delivered.
Yeah, and that's good strategy. Like, I tell people get a little uncomfortable when we start trying to move cyber around, but I'm like, when you're working with Congress, you got to hitch your wagon to the train that is moving, stand on the rail security. I did that in real time. And I tell people, I'm like, if it's the farm bill, if it's the supplemental, if money is moving through Congress, get what you need there. And one other thing I will add with the state and local grant program, and I have to take ownership of this mistake too, because I was working at the National Security Council of the White House on legislative affairs when that program was created. I also think we have got to get small communities and rural communities out of the grant writing business. I don't know how many people ED serves, and I love that we can humanize this with ED, but why do we have ED writing a grant request when we know what ED needs?
And one of the things that New York did, not to toot our own horn, is we wrote a grant plan, which we publicly released, because again, serious people write stuff down, and we said we're going to prioritize shared services, and we worked across 19 different community representatives from multiple, you have to do a bunch of work. It's actually easier for the states and the state administrative agency and FEMA, who administers this grant with CISA, to just pass the money through.
So you exploited that system well. No, I'm joking. You used it well. I do want to mention one thing, though.
We did shared services, actually, because if you don't have a person like at the governor's office driving that, people will default to just have them write a grant and it'll be over.
One thing, a mistake that you and I are talking about, I made the same one you did, is it's not putting it in the base. I mean, when we go for adding it to the Inflation Reduction, or in that case, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, or in the case I'm saying a supplemental bill, I've kicked the problem 3 years. And 3 years from now, some other person is going to be facing this where that money is no longer available. And the problem's not going away. States and localities are not going to be solved, even if we had 3 more years of money. This is a persistent issue that we fail to acknowledge by having a base budget issue. And this gets back to what you're saying with congressional committees. It's very hard for them to take ownership of something in the authorizations if they know their appropriators are only going to pay for it by taking away from something else they authorized. So this is a challenge we have if we don't put it in the base. And the only base that can absorb it's the Department of Defense, and they're smart enough to say, not us.
Yeah. And I want to turn to you, Ann, because as we're talking about these programs, you are also working at the state and local level with the universities, with the small towns that are, you know, as we fight about this in DC, as we fight about this in the governor's office, these are the folks that are like, actually, we are out in the community every day for the folks that are not protecting government critical infrastructure, but are protecting our economy, also protecting our healthcare systems. And so I want to ask you, what does the tension look like on the ground at the policy level for the communities that you're working with?
Yeah, thanks. And I think first, hats off to New York, because you're just really setting an example for so many other states of the art of the possible. And I'd kind of double click on this idea of shared services as well. In our work, we're concerned with what we'd call the last mile gap for community organizations. And as Colin was saying, if you've ever been on the internet, you know that there are a zillion PDFs telling small organizations how to do their cybersecurity framework, what to prioritize, but people don't have time, and oftentimes the cyber expertise to consume that information. And so you have this gap in services where community organizations like K through 12 schools, like your local food bank, like your small municipal government, your water utility, every organization that is vital to community life and is expert in their own field, but is not expert in cybersecurity. And for the most part, policy leaves them to fend for themselves. And so we have tried to stand up more robust and more collaborative cyber volunteering programs. They come in lots of different flavors. University-based cybersecurity clinics is one flavor, and as I mentioned, there are now over 40 of those in the United States, where students, as part of their coursework, go out into the community, do risk assessments, do incident response planning, and educate the community about cyber risk. It's also a great workforce development program, so it's a win-win in that way. But there are a lot of other volunteer programs that are growing. 6 states have state civilian cyber corps, which are volunteer programs often based in emergency management or as part of the National Guard that will go out into the community and help with incident response, saving states and saving taxpayers millions of dollars. And then there are corporate volunteering programs as well, where cybersecurity professionals like yourselves can get involved in the community and do a mission with a small organization that is helping keep a local community vibrant and delivering vital services. So this is non-governmental capacity, public service through cyber volunteers, and I think we'll probably turn to this, but the policy need is for the states to be able to work in a whole of state framework and coordinate more closely with those volunteers so that the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, and I think especially for this audience, and when we wrap, we'll give them very direct call to actions, but I think as we talk about these volunteer programs, getting the audience involved in these as well, because when we think about some of the people you're serving, it's like, these people are a part of the infrastructure that supports our hospitals, that supports our schools. And so when you think about the HVAC company that's in the town and one of the, maybe not the biggest employer, but the entire city buildings are using the HVAC system. The hospital is using the HVAC system. And we know what it looks like when those systems are infiltrated and how they are connected to the hospital, how they are connected to the school.
And it's existential. For a small business, one ransomware attack, you're done.
Yeah, you're done. And you're done, and that whole community feels that ripple effect over and over and over again. And so I want us to turn to our policy recommendations, because I think it's important to kind of, we've identified the threats, we've talked about the tensions, and I want to say policy recommendations that are actually realistic and very articulate of like what it is that you all need and what do you think would help us address some of these threats. I'll start with you, Ann, as we were just talking about getting to some of the things that are needed. Tell us what, in your seat, Magic Wand, what is it that you need authorized, what do you need appropriated, and who do you need to do it?
So obviously states are doing a lot, but it does need to be backstopped by the state and local cybersecurity grant program, the tribal cybersecurity grant program, and we need to see more of that money be directed to services. Oftentimes, states can procure technology, but for these small organizations that we're talking about, giving them technology is like giving them that puppy. It needs to be maintained, it needs to be implemented, it needs to be updated. So that's one piece, be able to direct more of that money to direct services. And then the second piece is frameworks for whole of state cybersecurity, where volunteers and cyber volunteers would have a way to pass a baton to the kinds of shared services that Colin has been talking about, so that those small entities are getting cybersecurity care in a more in perpetuity kind of way, or ongoing way, after the volunteers come in and do incident response, or after they come in and get that small organization started on their cybersecurity maturity journey.
Yeah. I'll turn to you next, Colin. What's your magic policy recommendation?
I think that we talk about the importance of communications and critical infrastructure. I think Mark rightly mentioned Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon and others. We need the federal government to meaningfully and prescriptively regulate the telecommunications industry, especially in the wake of Volt Typhoon. It used to be, back when some of us got started, I won't point any fingers, that when the internet stopped working, the phones started ringing, right? That used to be the saying. Now, the telephones are on the internet. No longer is it a plain old POTS or a PSTN, or right? We're talking about VoIP, we're talking about packet-switched voice communications networks. And the robustness of the plain old telephone system, it would absolutely blow your mind, the kinds of regulations that telecommunications companies mostly were under to keep communications in an operable state in the face of widespread degradation and deliberate destruction, right? That's not the case anymore for the internet, and that's a problem. So, and first and foremost, I'm not at the state level well equipped to do that, right? That's fundamentally an interstate problem. So number one is at the state level, we control things like energy distribution, water quality, hospital care. Those are things that states can do. States should step up, and they need to do. But those major moving pieces at the federal level, I would say number one, communications. Obviously, there's others. And number two is deterrence. And actually, Mark and I and one of our other collaborators, Dr. Erica Lonergan, have written some pieces on the importance of the cyber force and the cyber auxiliary and some of these other things too. It's great that individual states are making these moves. It would be really, really great if the federal government would acknowledge the need for a cyber force and resource it and give it the authorities it needs, and.
Yeah, I think that's great. I want to turn to Mark, he's not probably going to have any recommendations on this. He's not passionate about it at all. What's your recommendation, Mark?
Well, first, I do want to comment on comms. I love that you brought that up, because communications, a lot of us were tricked. I was one of the people saying that they were like below energy and finance, but above everybody else. And it's because they do spend a lot on cybersecurity, but it's on the corporate network, which is good for us with our credit cards that we've given to those companies. I do appreciate that. But it turns out the core networks don't have cybersecurity consistently placed in them in a valuable way, because the operators go, you are installing something slowing down my network, and the valuation of my network versus competing telecom networks is judged by speed and resilience and your cybersecurity upgrade is going to slow down my speed. So that's where you need regulation. Say, no, everyone will have this. And once everyone has it, they're not opposed to cybersecurity. They're opposed to having something riding on their system that their corporate adversary doesn't. Yeah. So I agree with that. On the recommendations, I'll go right back to state and local cybersecurity. We've got to get that in the supplemental. If we don't, and there's no money, everything else I'm about to say doesn't matter as much. The other one, sector risk management agencies. We need the Homeland Security committees to take the lead, do hearings on these to say these are important, but then drive those same hearings into the parochial the other committees that have, like TIA, transportation, energy and commerce, and science and technology, and then the same in the Senate. Because if you don't have those committees study their SRM, the performance of their federal agency as a sector risk management agency, and get advice from outsiders, we're going to continue to be in a low productivity environment. If I could add on one to your, I believe in the cyber force. I think I'm legally obligated to no longer argue for it. I've done too much. But I'll say, this administration says they're really interested in, they say offensive cyber, they mean defensive cybersecurity operations. And what they mean by that is aggressively defending our networks against attacks from adversaries. And I get what they're saying. And I think they've settled, Sean Cairncross has wisely settled on, I need help from the private sector in technology and in defending networks. But me, the government, this is Sean speaking, we need to do the defensive cyber operations to protect them. The only way you can do that's the national, in my opinion, is the National Guard. It would be better if we had a cyber force and a cyber guard, because we have massively inconsistent National Guards. States that you'd expect, like Maryland and Virginia, have unbelievable cyber National Guards. New York and California and Texas have good ones. But then there's 44 other states and 3 or 4, territories that don't have. There's states I know with only 2 or 3 cyber operators in their whole guard. That's not acceptable. So if we're going to have defensive cyber operations done, we've got to get the National Guard right. So that's where I'd put a lot of my effort, and that's from the executive branch side. The executive branch has got to lead that. Congress can back it up with laws after the executive branch decides how they want to do it.
Yeah, and then I spent a lot of time translating cyber issues to lawmakers who realistically don't work on cybersecurity. I tell people, I'm like, it's something we talk about all day, every day, but if you're a member of Congress, you're talking about healthcare. Sometimes you're talking about cybersecurity as it relates to healthcare, but you're talking about the economy. Sometimes you're talking about cybersecurity as it relates to the economy. And when we talk about this administration's move toward this aggressive defense, the analogy I've been using is a hotel will have cameras and will have locks. But aggressive defense is to also make sure security guards are walking the floors and making sure that no doors are left open. And I do think we have to move toward that. And it is a point of distinction from offensive cyber. And I think, to your point, the administration prioritizing that, I would also offer translating that. I think many members of Congress would be interested in funding that. They just we're losing people across the translation.
I agree.
And I'll say, as my policy recommendation, I think we have, when you talk about the 4 legs of the stool, Colin, across water, healthcare, energy, I just forgot the
Public sector.
Public safety. I feel like the state and local grant program, and I say we because I worked on that legislation as well, we created a little bit of a Hunger Games between these critical infrastructure sectors. Like, there is no reason that water needs to be competing with energy for money. And so when I think about my policy recommendations, I think the state and local grant program should be authorized, it should be appropriated, but we also, as these threat assessments come out and we know Iran is focused on our water sector, or we know there's more of a focus from China on our energy sector, we also need to be mobile enough that when that threat increases, we can get money to these sectors very specifically, quickly. And that doesn't take away from the consistency that we need for the state and local grant program. And we actually need multi-year authorizations. I want to get us as policy people out of the business of every year we got to be ready for this fight. Every year we got to make sure more money is put in. And we can do that at the federal level. We see it across multiple programs. They get funded for 5 years at a time. They get authorized for 5 years at a time. And that gives these states also a level of consistency because they know the money is going to continue to come in. So we actually we were very aggressive with our timing, y'all. We were like, we did prep sessions and we were like 2-3 minutes responses. And so we are going to do a lightning round at the end, but I also want to give an opportunity if there's anyone that has any questions, we're happy to do a round of questions. If you'll just go to the microphone and then just state your name, organization, and ask away. Remember, we are not members of Congress, and none of us are currently in the administration, but we're happy to answer any of your policy questions.
And one thing I did want to mention is on the March 11th, we didn't plan this, but on March 11th, our water regulations, we have harmonized regulations across our Department of Environmental Conservation, our sort of EPA analog, and our Department of Health. which regulates, so one regulates wastewater and one regulates drinking water. And so we have, I think we're the first state to do prescriptive baseline cyber regulations that are tiered, so tiered by size of entity and importance, paired with a technical assistance program and a grant program for the water and wastewater sectors. And so, money, meat, mouth, right? Yeah. In 2022, the governor signed legislation giving her Public Service Commission the authority to regulate energy distribution, cybersecurity, which they have since done. And then we did hospitals 2 years ago, and over the last year we've done water. And then last year we signed a piece of legislation on public safety, mandatory reporting, and training, and some other things. So it is totally possible, but you have one foot in front of the other. And I think these water regulations that we have put forward, there was some wailing and gnashing of teeth, but we engage with the Rural Water Association. There is not some magical answer. You just got to go out and meet these folks. And the thing they said is, I don't just want a grant program. I want actual human people who can help me do this stuff. And so we, obviously we've talked to some of the cyber clinics, but having full-time civil servants whose only job is to provide technical assistance to this the people covered by this regulation, really I think is who are going to be there, right? These are full-time, these are FTEs, these are real people.
I think we've discovered over the last 5 years of trying to implement top-down, all sector applying rules doesn't work. It works for if you need to prioritize recovery, then I understand you have to be cross-domain. But I think what you're going to see in the Hill this year, legislation this year, is you're going to see a much more aggressive attempt at sector by sector like this. And we're working it in the military mobility, the rail system, aviation system, and port system. And it's hard for a state with low numbers. New York and California might be able to do this, maybe Texas, but all the others, you'd really just be helping one company. That gets very hard ethically, very fast. So by doing it at the federal level, running an authorities program that says, here's the standard we want you to do, here's the free technical assessment or an access, needs-based access to a technical assessment, and then here's the grant program to get at it. And I think we're gonna have to do it sector by sector. The idea of doing it writ large with just too many committees, you'd never get regulation like that, absent a major cyber Pearl Harbor kind of event, something that really cost lives.
Yeah, and I would just want to plus one. You alluded to the mandatory incident reporting. I think that can't be understated either. We just have so little data at the granular level that we need at the state and local level, and by sector, empirical evidence about what controls are working. Some of this lives in the insurance companies, but having a really good public data set is a huge step forward.
Yeah, that's cool.
And I will say just a kudos to Colin and the state of New York with what you all have done. I think people don't always realize in the policy space, you also do need models for what works. And so what New York has done at the state level can be done at the federal level. And you have the advocates like Mark and Ann and myself, our job is to show Congress this is what this model looks like, and here is a success that has already happened in New York. And I think that isn't always understood. I tell people, congressional staffers are sitting down with a blank Word document or a Google Doc, and they're being asked to create a grant program. And they're being asked to figure out what it looks like to have managed service providers. And the point to Colin about also people need to be deployed to these places. I use my hometown as an example. I love growing up in a town with no traffic lights, but most people don't want to move there.
Yeah.
And so this idea that someone is going to come save my town and come in as a cyber expert is not realistic. Yeah. And so how do you get people who live in these communities trained to not become the CISO of a Fortune 500 company, but trained enough to be able to protect the systems that they're already in charge of?
And one thing that I think an underutilized resource is the state fusion centers. So each state and territory has a federally funded MOU fusion center, and at our fusion center, it's run by the state police and our emergency management agency. And one of the first things the governor did was double the size of the cyber component in this intelligence center, and created these things that we've called nitro teams, which are state troopers, and sort of analysts, non-sworn members, who actively deploy to critical infrastructure sites along with in sort of a purple team. So a law enforcement professional and a homeland security professional that go to a place and say, well, we need to acquire forensically sound images so that we can work with the Bureau to do, apply consequences to these cyber actors. And here's the state cyber incident response team and Homeland Security who's also here to provide you guidance and remote support and all this other stuff. But having, and the person who actually goes there is a state trooper, right? Yeah. Drives in a car from a state police barracks, knocks on the door and says, I am from the state troopers and I'm here to help. You called this number and here we are. And I'm gonna get on the phone with my compadre back at the ranch and we're gonna help you through this. This happens obviously a lot, and that kind of, you gotta go there. You just there's not another secret, you just have to go there and meet these people and help them through this problem, and you can't solve every problem, but you can definitely, send people there, and it makes a big difference.
We have a question right there.
Oh, yes, sorry.
So, Nicole, first of all, great job steering this panel. I know you and each of the panelists could download information all day long. My name is Jeff Brancato. I run an organization called the Northeast Ohio Cyber Consortium. And what I am interested in getting your perspectives on is I want to add a couple more elements to the constellation and then get your thoughts on how we create a dense network and really scale this up. So,
okay, do it quickly though,
yes,
because we're getting the hook behind you.
You mentioned coordinating councils. Next to the coordinating councils are the industry-run ISACs. My organization is a regional cross-sector ISAC. I talk to Colin's peer in Ohio all the time. One of my committee chairs is the leader for the Cyber Reserve in Cleveland. How do we continue to get the private sector up to speed and then better connected into the rest of the system?
Well, first, extend CERCIA, get better information exchange, get the liability protections that some companies need to operate. Yep. I appreciate everything you're doing. I love ISACs. We've had them around for 25 years. The ones that are really effective are the ones that rapidly exchange information with a minimal thing. If I give one advice to the federal government, declassify things to the lowest possible level to include unclassified. There's almost no value in TSSCI temporally speaking.
And with that, we have about 3 minutes. And so I want for our lightning round, for the folks in this audience, the one call to action that you have for them, also we helped y'all out and it's also on our slide. But I'll go, my first call to action, I know it sounds very old school, but I actually do need y'all to call your member of Congress. I need you to call your member of Congress. I need you to ask who's in charge of cyber. If no one's in charge of cyber, someone's working with rural communities, someone's working on national security. Your members of Congress need to hear from you that this is important, and everybody in this room can do this. It doesn't matter what your job is. You need to call your member of Congress. Call your House member, call your Senate member. They'll put you on a list. They track who called and what they called to talk about. All right, Colin.
Resilience, resilience, resilience. Most people's imagination for how bad things could be or will get is frankly not good enough. And unfortunately, for those of us who've been in this business a long time, trains are coming, right? Coming down the tracks. And you can be either on the tracks or on the train, to extend our train metaphor. So I think, building resilience, operational resilience, technical resilience into your organizations. Don't wait for a bad day to have a plan. Obviously, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face, right? But you cannot deviate from a plan you don't have, and you cannot adjust from a plan you haven't written down, and you can't do that if you haven't practiced it, right? So I would say, focus on resilience, and then have a plan. And there is a million great resources. The federal government has a lot of them, actually. But I think resilience.
All right, Ann.
Okay, I'll add to this mix and say the future of cybersecurity is local. So if you're interested in getting involved at the local level with the human network of infrastructure that's trying to solve this problem, come to one of our regional cyber civil defense summits this year. There's one in Louisiana, one in Arizona, and one in New Jersey, and we would love to see you there.
Yeah. All right, Mark.
Thanks for the question. Thanks for the great moderating. Nicole, keeping us on time. Hey, look, I'm going to talk about my two co-panelists and say the key here to state local cybersecurity is at the top level. States like, and New York's a great one. Another, TJ White, who's going to be a panelist with us from Texas. I think Florida Cyber in Florida. You got to have a committed state effort. And then that's at the kind of the macro level of the state. At the micro level are clinics. And not just, your clinics are great. Also, Google runs a clinics program. There's good stuff going on there. Clinics come from the community up. If you're tackling this from the state house and state legislator down and the communities up, you're going to solve this problem for you. And your resilience will improve greatly.
Well, with that, I would like to thank the audience for coming so early in the morning, but also thank you all for your affirmation nods and your applause. We really appreciate it, and we hope that you've gotten something at this panel today that you can take home to your state and to your local level, and you all are all going to call your member of Congress. So thank y'all.